Funding for this program is provided by the John M. Olin Foundation and the Star Foundation.
Oh no! Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. On our show today, Nobel Prize-winning economist Milton Friedman offers a little free advice to the next President of the United States. Right now, Al Gore and George W. Bush are both busy spending millions on their presidential campaigns. They have some decisions to make. How much to spend on TV spots, how much to spend on print ads, for that matter, how much to spend on confetti at the conventions. But when one of them is finally elected president, the money in his campaign coffer will look like chicken feed by comparison with the money in the federal treasury. For the next president, whoever he is, 5 questions. How to keep the economy growing, what to do about the federal surplus, how to fix Social Security, how to improve education, and what to do about health care. In each case, billions of dollars are at stake. Consider the surplus. Will the next president use it to pay down the federal debt, to launch big new federal programs, or to cut taxes and put a little money back in the taxpayers' own pockets? Needless to say, on each of the 5 questions, Milton Friedman has an answer. We now give the next president the opportunity to be briefed by Milton Friedman. We'll send tapes to all the candidates. So question number 1.
And they will have complete freedom to throw them away.
Question number 1, keeping the economy growing. Let me open, if I may, with a tale of 2 administrations. The economy expands during the administration of Ronald Reagan and during the administration of Bill Clinton. But of course they represent 2 quite different approaches. Reagan cuts marginal income tax rates quite dramatically. Top rate goes from about 70% to under 40%, but largely because he increases defense spending, he piles up massive federal deficits.
That's not the reason.
Okay, correct.
The reason the massive reason
Yep.
you had massive deficits
Right.
was because they were more successful in reducing inflation than they had anticipated. Inflation is very productive of taxes.
Right.
Because at that time there was no indexing of tax brackets, and inflation pushed people up into higher and higher brackets.
So they gave a larger percentage of their real income to the government.
Right. Now, after 1980, 81, when inflation came down much more sharply than anybody had predicted. If you look at the predictions at that time, they thought it would take 10 or more years to wring inflation out of the economy. It took more like 3 or 4 years. And as a result, the actual tax receipts during those periods were very much lower than the estimated tax receipts based on the higher inflation assumptions. Okay. And that's the main reason you got a deficit.
But we did get a deficit.
Because actual spending, the increase in spending on the military was offset by reductions in spending in the rest of the budget. Not entirely.
Not entirely.
Not entirely,
Right.
but very largely.
Okay. I'm rejiggering my question as we go here, but I'll keep going. So we have the Reagan, cutting taxes, but with the deficit piles up. But nevertheless, the economy grows. Then we have Clinton, who raises taxes early in his administration, and indeed his tax increases are on top of tax increases enacted by President Bush. But Clinton, we actually have, whether you give credit to President Clinton or the Republicans in Congress, we actually have relatively moderate growth in federal spending, so that as a proportion of GDP, the federal government actually shrinks. We end up in the last couple of years of the Clinton administration with a surplus. Who's a better model for the next president?
The better model is Reagan, cutting taxes. The reason you have a surplus
Today,
in my opinion, the credit for that has to be given overwhelmingly to gridlock.
To gridlock.
If you had had a Democratic House and Senate, as well as a Democratic president, you would not have a surplus today, in my opinion. They would have spent it.
Right.
Similarly, if you had had a Republican president, as well as a Republican House and Senate, I doubt that there would have been a surplus today, because they would either have spent it or had tax reductions.
So when President Clinton steps forward to take his bows, you don't applaud at all?
Well, I applaud. He provided gridlock.
Right. Okay. You applaud, but for a different reason from the one he supposes.
The really thing that really contributed to our successful economy over recent years is that the government has stayed out pretty much. That the White House and the Congress and the Senate haven't done much.
In this upcoming election, you'd hope for the White House and Congress to be captured by different parties? You hope for gridlock? Or what would you tell the next president
Well,
about keeping the economy growing?
first of all, I don't think the president has a great deal to do with keeping the economy going.
All right.
I think presidents have a great deal to do with keeping the economy from growing. If they can follow policies which will cause contractions.
Right.
But I think the economy is largely independent of the government, and what keeps it going is its own internal development. However, you can short-circuit that internal development. If you impose very high taxes
Right.
and eliminate the incentive to innovate, to improve, to take risks, to do things, you'll kill the economy.
Okay. Now,
And that's what's happened over and over again in other countries around the world.
Milton, I have to remind you at this point of a story that I heard from James Buckley, who served in the United States
Yes,
Senate.
I know.
He was elected in 1972. He flew down to Washington to meet President Nixon. As the door to the Oval Office opened, Nixon was concluding a meeting with John Ehrlichman, his domestic policy advisor. And as James Buckley walked into the Oval Office, the first words he heard Richard Nixon utter were, "I don't care what Milton Friedman says, he's not running for re-election." So the point is, if you're suggesting that the next president say in his inaugural address, "My fellow Americans, I promise not to get in the way of the economy," you're promising something that a politician finds unsatisfying.
That's right.
What would you just, what is there any positive thing?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
Cut taxes.
Cut taxes. Okay. What does Milton suggest we do with the federal budget surplus? We have money piling up in the federal coffers.
And you think you have choices.
Well,
You think you have choices.
we could spend it on new
Could you?
programs.
Don't you think if,
Right.
let me ask you a question.
All right, go ahead.
Suppose you don't cut taxes.
Right.
Do you think the surplus will last?
Do I think this? In other words, you're asking a political question.
Absolutely.
Can Congress resist the
Right,
temptation to spend it?
exactly.
My opinion
Yeah.
is no.
Right, that's
No.
mine too.
All right.
I think they cannot resist.
So this notion of paying down the debt is a nice idea, but it'll never happen.
It'll never happen. Moreover, I'll go further than that. Let's suppose you succeed. What may happen, what may really happen, is that because of the gridlock, for 2 or 3 years you do pay down the debt. What do you suppose will happen to those saved interest payments?
Oh, Socrates, I think I see where you're going with this.
And I want to ask you another question that ties in with that. I believe, and you believe, that saved interest payments would be spent on another government project. Would that government project do more or less harm than the payment of interest on the current debt?
That's a good question, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
That isn't obvious. I mean,
think it
that's
would
not
do-
obvious, or is it?
I
obvious?
think the answer is obvious. The marginal projects that government would undertake would certainly do more harm
All right.
than one of the least harmful of government expenditure projects is the payment of interest on debt.
Oh, I see. Right.
That's a transfer of money from
Right.
taxpayers to taxpayers.
Right. With the government skimming a little something for the bureaucracy.
That's right.
Right.
But in the main, you're taking money from taxpayers and you're giving it over to other taxpayers who own the bonds, and the harm that's done is by what the government takes off and by the fact that the higher tax rate tends to reduce incentives.
Right.
But that's so for regardless of what the money is used for. And if you look at what the money is used for, most government spending projects do harm, not good.
Okay. Now let me ask you, I want to back up to this question of cut taxes versus pay down the debt. So what you're saying is cut taxes because Congress will never be able to resist the temptation to spend it. Paying
Yeah.
down the debt may be a good idea, but it'll never happen. But let me ask you, as an economic matter, if Congress could find the willpower to pay down the debt, should it? In other words, if you have, what would be better at this point from purely on an economic analysis, paying down the debt or cutting taxes?
Well, let me talk about paying down the debt
right.
because that ties in with your Social Security problem.
Yes.
They're not really paying down the debt. They're converting funded
at
debt.
present?
No, they're
Right.
converting funded debt to unfunded debt because of the coming problem in Social Security. Let's look at it this way.
Right.
They pay down the debt. They buy up government bonds. What do they do with those government bonds? They put them over here in a box labeled Trust Fund for Social Security. Now you come to the period when current receipts from wage tax are too sparse to pay benefits.
Right, in the Social Security.
So they take these bonds out and sell them again to the public. How else are they going to pay for it? So what you're doing is simply changing the form of the debt, but you're not really reducing the debt because you've got this.
These obligations are going to be there.
And their
no
present
matter.
value is a debt.
Right.
And that debt is all recorded in this fake trust fund, which is pure paper artifice, has no real role.
But if you cut taxes,
Yeah.
what does that do to help the government meet its unfunded
It
obligations?
doesn't do a thing, but let's go back.
Right.
To meet the unfunded obligations, you really need a change in Social Security.
All right.
All of the rest of this talking about paying down the debt as a way of solving the Social Security problem
Is nonsense.
is an evasion. In the long run, government will spend whatever the tax system will raise, plus as much more as it can get away with. That's what history tells us, I think. And so my view has always been, cut taxes on any occasion, for any reason, in any way that's politically feasible, as the only way to keep down the size of government.
So you, for example, would be in favor of this ban on internet taxes?
That's a little difficult. No, I'm not saying that.
You're not?
No. I want to cut taxes, but there are better and worse taxes, better and worse taxes to cut. And there is a...
And the income tax is the one that really needs to be whacked at.
The income tax is the one that really needs to be whacked
Because
at.
the disincentives to produce...
Milton has already suggested the need to change Social Security. What would he do?
Social Security, how would you fix it, Milton?
The only way really to fix it in the long run is to convert it into a strictly privatized investment funds. Because what you really need is to increase savings. You see, why is it that when you get a life insurance policy, for example, you don't have the same problem? Why is it that there isn't an unfunded liability of the life insurance companies? Why don't they have a problem in the future? And the answer is because when you pay for your life insurance policy,
I'm paying for my life insurance
your
policy.
life insurance,
Right,
the company takes that money and invests it in real capital.
right.
And that real capital, the machine, the building, the house, whatever it is, provides an income which will be available to pay you your benefits when the time comes.
Right.
On the other hand, in the case of the present Social Security system, the money you pay isn't being used to produce any real capital that will be productive in the future. It's being put into pieces of paper, to promises to pay. There's nothing there which will yield more income. So the only real solution to Social Security is to shift to a system under which you have higher savings, under which you have fully funded benefits, fully funded annuities. But without going into too much technical detail, the essence of it is that you have to shift to a privatized system. You have to recognize that for a while you're going to have to pay twice, as it were.
Right. That is to say, my generation or the one that follows will have to pay for retirees and themselves.
The young have always paid for the Social Security of the old.
Right.
But what it used to be is that people, the young would pay for the Social Security of their parents. Now the young pay for the Social Security of somebody else's parents.
Right.
And that's a change for the worse and not the better. I think it's a very unjust system.
You don't buy, I mean, even the harshest critics of the welfare state say, look, we have to admit that Social Security eliminated poverty among the elderly. That is the one success that everyone agrees on, right?
Sure.
And
But
you-
at what cost?
Ah, all right.
Tell me, here's a young man, 40 years old. He suddenly discovers he's got AIDS. He's got 10 more years to live. And the government comes along and say, we have to take 15% of your income to provide for your old age after 65.
And it's by law, and we don't care when you die. We're going to take that money, right?
Is that just?
No, that's ridiculous.
We want responsible individuals. People should take care of their own old age.
New president, take note. Education, Milton. We have,
Education ought not to be a federal issue.
but the president has to say something about it.
Yes.
All the polls show that it's
I'll
at the
tell you
top
what
of
he
people's
should say.
concerns. What should he say?
He should say, I am announcing tonight that the Federal Department of Education is disbanded,
Right?
that the amount of money that we are now sending to the states we will continue to send in the form of free funds for them to use at a declining rate and get through with that subsidy over the next 10 years. And we want the education to be handled by the individual states, by the local governments, by the parents. That the parents are the only ones who have a real responsibility for the schooling of their children. There is nothing in the Constitution that justifies the federal government being involved in schooling children.
You know, Milton, if this economic...
Next issue for the next president, what to do about health care.
medical care. Now, that's something that you may say the federal government ought not to be in it, but it's in it.
Yes.
And we have this paradox, this peculiar paradox, that in recent decades we've seen one miraculous medical breakthrough after another, and yet at the same time increasing dissatisfaction with health care in this country.
And an enormous increase in spending.
And an enormous increase in spending.
In the period from 1929 to 1950, spending on medical care in the United States never it was between 3 and 5% of national income.
1929 to 1950?
Yeah.
Between 3 and 5%.
Roughly.
That's low.
Well,
I mean, by comparison with anything I ever heard about what's going on today.
yeah.
Right.
Today it's 14%.
All right.
Today the nation is spending more on medical care than on all the food, alcohol and tobacco they put in their mouth. We've had an absolutely tremendous increase. And what's more, the U.S. spending on medical care is way out of line with other countries.
All right, so you're suggesting then that this is out of whack. It's not just
Absolutely out of whack.
due payment for all these marvelous breakthroughs we've had.
All of these other countries have had these marvelous breakthroughs. The second highest country is now Germany at 10%. 14, we're over 14, they're 10.
So we should, of course, socialize our medical system the way Germany has.
Yes, that's one answer, but it's not the right answer. If we really fully socialize the medical system,
Right.
costs would go down
They would indeed go down.
because government would ration medicine.
Okay, so
Now,
the right answer is...
let me go back. The reason we have trouble, fundamental reason why we have high expenses and trouble, is because everything is a third-party payment. Nobody pays for himself. Very rarely. That's an exaggeration.
right.
But most payments for medicine are third-party payments. The insurance company pays, the government pays, but if you're my physician and I come to you, there's no payment between us.
Right.
And as a result, everybody is spending everybody else's money. And nobody spends somebody else's money as carefully as he spends his own. Why should people have to get their medical care in that way? Why shouldn't they be able to arrange for it themselves? Why shouldn't they be able to pay for it directly? The problem really resolves itself into catastrophe versus ordinary. With respect to ordinary medical care expenses, they're relatively modest. There's no reason why people can't pay for it on their own.
Ordinary would be, I have a cold, my kids get the flu, that sort of thing.
You have an annual examination. You take your kids in for a regular examination.
Right.
Those are the ordinary expenses.
Right.
The catastrophic expenses arise when you have a major thing.
AIDS, heart attack, cancer.
Right. And in most areas, we buy insurance only for catastrophic expenses.
Right.
You don't insure your house for against the cost of having to mow your lawn.
No.
You
Just
don't
to
insure your car in such a way that if you buy gasoline, you get repaid by the insurance company.
Right. Right.
But in medical care, we've gotten almost to that point, where medical insurance provided by the employer, if you have to get some aspirins, you have to get approval and it's paid for. That's a little exaggeration because there
not that much.
There are deductibles,
Right.
but the deductibles are relatively small.
Right.
And so the system that should have developed, it seemed to me, is a system under which people would buy insurance for catastrophic expenses, very, very high deductible of $4,000 or $5,000 a year, not a few hundred or $1,000. But with the employer-provided medical care, that's not, of course, what you're going to have.
Right.
But so
As with any tax exemption, there's a huge incentive to push as much under the exemption as you can.
Of course.
Right, okay.
So it has two effects. It causes you to have this third-party payment, but it also causes you to spend more on medical care than you would spend if you were free to dispose of your income after tax as you wish.
Right.
So the right solution, in my opinion, is again to privatize. And there are two ways to do that.
Right.
You can either eliminate the tax exemption, which I think is politically not feasible,
Right.
or you can spread the tax exemption and say it will apply.
Spread it. Go ahead.
It will apply to expenses paid by you. See, if you pay now, the medical care expenses you pay now out of your own pocket
Are after tax.
are after tax
Right.
income. But with medical savings accounts, you set it up so that you put money into the medical saving account, and when you pay your medical
Untaxed money.
untaxed money, when you pay your medical care from that, it's not subject to tax.
So
That would extend the tax exemption, but permit the elimination of employer-provided, or at least the substitution of personally provided medical care.
and what would you do? You'd phase out Medicaid and Medicare somehow?
In my ideal situation, I would phase out Medicare and Medicaid, but I would have government provide catastrophic insurance, voucherize it.
You would keep the location of catastrophic insurance in the government?
No.
I'm- just explain what you
I'm
mean.
under Medicare.
All right.
The government is committed to paying for a certain part of my medical care.
Right.
Let them give me a voucher which I can use to buy a catastrophic insurance policy,
I see.
equal to the amount that they're committed to spend on me.
I see.
But let
But the
the market
decision now
work,
becomes that of the individual in the
and
marketplace.
let the market work.
Okay. Now,
Milton has given us a few radical proposals. Does he really think the next president could carry them out?
Milton, here's what I see you counseling the next president to say. My fellow Americans,
You're the speechwriter.
we're
I'm not.
eliminating Social Security. I'm whacking the Department of Education. I'm phasing out Medicare and Medicaid. And by the way, this tax exemption for medical expenses when it's paid by the employer, I'm looking askance at that too. Now, this is a little hard to
That's why I'm not a politician.
Okay. Now, here's my last question then.
You're never going to do all of these,
Right.
but it's well to have in mind what you'd like to do,
Oh, that is for certain.
so that
right.
the incremental, everything has to be done incrementally. It will
Right.
be done.
Right.
But unless you have in mind where you want to go, you're not sure your steps are taking you there.
Right.
And so I'm not putting this forth as a practically feasible platform for tomorrow. I'm saying let's look at the long run, where you would like to be, and let's ask ourselves with respect to each proposal, does it take it in that direction or does it take it in the opposite direction?
All right. That's a fair statement. Now, as it applies to politics, I read one of the central lessons of your whole life's work as this: the less government, the better.
That's right.
All right. Let me ask you to make a prediction there. Let's assume that the next president, whoever he is, this is your judgment of the political state of the country. The next president, whoever he is, let's assume that he serves 2 terms. So 8 years from now, 2008, will the federal government as a proportion of GDP be smaller than it is at present or bigger?
Whether it's smaller or bigger will not depend on whether people have listened to this program or have read what I write. It will depend on how effective the internet is in making it hard to collect taxes.
Oh, now you've just thrown a whole new topic at me. Explain what you mean by that.
Well, the internet is, one of the great virtues of the internet is that it enables people to make transactions at a distance, anonymously, over various countries, right now.
And in secret, encrypted.
Encrypted.
Right.
And so it makes it much more difficult to collect taxes.
I see.
And if that effect is strong enough, then government spending as a fraction of GDP will be lower than it is now.
So sales taxes also would be in trouble because I could presumably buy my LL Bean sweater in an encrypted form through some secondhand reseller in Bermuda or Barbados.
Absolutely.
And I could presumably, if I could swing this, it would be marvelous. I could get paid through Curacao.
Right.
Also, my income could be encrypted.
Absolutely.
So what would the government be left to tax?
Property.
My car, my house, and that's a world that makes you smile.
No,
No?
'cause it's not going to go that far.
Oh, it won't.
It won't go that far. There are things that you're not going to be able to avoid. The most obvious subjects for taxation are things that are fixed. That's why property taxes
Can't hide
are
my
among
house.
the first. You
Right.
can't hide your house. You tax people. They can move.
Mm-hmm.
That's why state income taxes can't possibly reach the level that federal income taxes reach, because a barrier to a person moving from one country to another is much higher than moving across states.
California to Nevada.
Right. Similarly, the internet comes along, and now computer companies are hiring people in India to do their work for them, and they're paying them in India. That's something that never gets into the U.S. tax system.
Right.
So you have, in addition to the kind of tax evasion that you're speaking of, you have the fact that transactions take place in a way that are attracted to the low tax areas.
So this was sort of concluding note to the next president would be, if you're a Democrat, this may upset you. If you're a Republican, it may cause you secret glee. But one way or the other, the technology is moving such that government is likely to get smaller.
Right.
Milton Friedman, thank you very much. One of Milton Friedman's central pieces of advice to the next president: cut taxes to give money back to the taxpayers every chance you get. Something about me especially likes that piece of advice. I'm Peter Robinson. Thanks for joining us.